There's a new front in Syria. Turkish troops crossing into Afrin province under the control of Syrian Kurdish forces since 2012. The push that started 4 days ago, part of plans to prevent the Kurds from establishing a continuous territory along the Turkish border. It comes days after the United States pledged a 2-year commitment to support Syria's Kurds. Will Ankara make good on its design to next go for Manbij? That's an Arab-majority town that's also under Kurdish control and inside of that U.S. protected zone. It would be a direct challenge to a fellow NATO member. The U.S. Secretary of State happens to be here in Paris for a conference on chemical weapons in Syria, which serves as a reminder that the Assad regime, along with its Russian and Iranian backers, remains an integral part of this story. And while we focus on the Turkish border, Damascus's offensive on nearby Idlib province continues, complete with a food blockade for civilians. As always with Syria, the argument rages over where the priorities lie. Today in the France 24 debate, we're looking at Erdogan's new front. And with us from Ankara, Ahmet Berat Çonkar, member of parliament for the ruling AK party and head of the Turkish delegation to the NATO Parliamentary Assembly. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much, sir.
Also in the Turkish capital, correspondent Jasper Mortimer is with us. Good to see you. Here in the studio, France 24 senior correspondent James Andre, who covered the liberation of Raqqa in Syria. And from Washington, Michael Predge, an adjunct fellow at the Hudson Institute, former intelligence advisor to General Petraeus and to Kurdish Peshmerga forces. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
The France 24 debate on Facebook and Twitter, the hashtag F24debate. Ankara is calling it Operation Olive Branch. James Andre, before we turn to the rest of our panel, let's look at the map, because that's what's key in this.
Absolutely, it's a good idea. Now, I'm going to go to the map right here. Now, we have a map that is going to come up on this screen in just a second. Here it is. Perfect. So here we have Syria. Indeed, as you see, this green part is what is controlled by the Syrian government. This orange part is all the part that is controlled by the Kurdish, basically PYD, YPG forces. Now, indeed, they have grown a large chunk of territory here along the Turkish border. Turkey is right here. And where most of the fighting is concentrating right now is here in Afrin. Now, this is the first part in which the Kurds actually set up what we have now, which is a kind of a proto-state, if you will, especially in all this part. I've been there, indeed, earlier on last year in November. I was there again. And indeed, what we have here is indeed a zone which is completely controlled, administrated by the PYD party and secured by Syrian Democratic Forces, which are a force which combines both Kurdish fighters and Arab fighters. They are indeed under the control of the YPG. Now, indeed, what's been happening here is that for the Turkish, the Turks consider that the YPG is part of PKK, or is an emanation of the
insurgency, the Kurdish insurgency that they're fighting since 2015.
Exactly. Indeed. Well, no, they've been at war with PKK. Absolutely, but it started back in 1984.
Sure.
And indeed, Abdullah Öcalan, who is the leader of the PKK, is in prison in Turkey. And indeed, the Western forces consider that the YPG is something different from PKK, but indeed, for the Turks, it is the same organization. Now, roughly a week ago, what the Americans did was say they wanted to form a border force to secure the border along Syria with Turkey of about 30,000 men, and they said that half the armored personnel deployed there would be YPG fighters. And this, of course, to Turkey is totally unacceptable. They say that amounts to creating a terrorist army along the border with Turkey, and this is why they've launched Operation Olive Branch. Now, this is very much the problem. Now, as you can see, there is this enclave of Afrin, and for the moment, the Turks are concentrating their effort here.
And just to be clear, Afrin is not part of that U.S. protected zone.
Well, this is what the US is saying now. What they were saying before is that basically, if we can have that previous map eventually again, but the YPG and Syrian Democratic Forces helped the US and the coalition fight the Islamic State group in this part, if you like, which is here. And indeed, they're the forces that liberated Raqqa with the help of the US Army. Now, they were indeed very much allies, and the US has got bases close to Manbij. They've got personnel in this part. Indeed, they have military presence in this northern part of Syria, which is under YPG control. But indeed, they say, the Americans say, that they have no military presence in Afrin, and that all they can do is indeed work on the diplomatic front.
Ahmed Berat Shankar, listening to James Andre's explanation there as we looked at the map. Explain to us the timeline. Why this offensive at this particular moment? Is it triggered by that announcement out of Washington last week?
Of course, that announcement by Washington also rang the alarm bells in Turkey. But of course, our operation is not just because of that announcement. Turkey has been receiving terrorist threats and attacks from the Afrin region for a very long time. There has been a lot of infiltration by the PKK, PYD from this region inside Turkey, and we have seen suicide car bombings. After 2015, we had 14 terrorist incidents inside Turkey, and most of the training was done in the Syrian part that is controlled by the PKK's Syrian wing, PYD, YPG. So this area has been on our focus because it is extremely threatening for Turkey, and also the southern border of NATO is threatened by a terrorist organization which is coming inside of Turkey and organizing terrorist attacks. And also they are trying to get access to the Mediterranean, and by sea routes they would like to access Europe. So this kind of important location for the terrorist organization is a very dangerous threat for Turkey.
But why now? Why at this particular moment the offensive?
Because, as you see, the United States has promised that the relationship with SDF, so-called SDF, which is the other name of YPG, would be a tactical relationship until defeating Daesh, and basically they would end supplying armaments and training to this group after the Daesh threat is eliminated. However, we have seen with the announcement from the U.S. Defense Department that they are planning to trying to legitimize this terrorist organization by naming them as a border security force or internal policing force, which could not be accepted for a serious territorial integrity as a sovereign country. This basically ring the alarm bells for Turkey. So we have seen that the United States is not keeping its promises that they have done before.
All right, so Michael Pregent, explain to us the timing of that announcement last week out of Washington to stay on for 2 years to back those Kurdish-led forces in Syria.
Yes, so the decision last week to do that, I do believe that was concerning to Erdogan. We continue to say that it's not the YPG, it's the Syrian Defense Forces, but the YPG is the command and control of those units. They decide who is allowed in the SDF. They've conscripted Sunni Arabs in Raqqa to join the YPG. So when we say Syrian Defense Forces, everybody else hears YPG. And it doesn't matter what the balance is. If the YPG is part of it, it's concerning to Turkey.
Concerning to Turkey, and your reaction to Ahmet Berat Shankar saying that, well, this offensive that's taken place in Afrin province, it does have to do with that announcement from Washington. Michael Pregent?
Oh, yeah, it does. I think Erdogan's testing to see what he can get away with. It's very difficult for a U.S. embedded advisor with the YPG or the Syrian Defense Forces to say, the YPG in Afrin, they're different than you guys because the YPG in Afrin aligned itself with Russia, with Assad and Iran, and actually invited Revolutionary Guard Corps advisors into Afrin. So we can't divide the YPG when you're dealing in a situation where we're stepping away from criticizing Erdogan for attacking Kurds in Afrin, and we're trying to isolate or insulate our YPG forces in Manbij and in Raqqa and say, well, we'll protect you. It doesn't make any sense to them if you allow part of their group to be attacked in Afrin. What means you're not? What guarantees do they have that we're not going to allow it in Manbij and Raqqa? And we're hearing that from the Free Syrian Army. There was a delegation that came to D.C. that I met with last week with some colleagues, and they basically hinted that this is the next step for Raqqa as well. Turkish forces backed by FSA will go to remove the YPG. Their argument is that the YPG is not allowing Sunni refugees from Turkey to come back into Raqqa. And our argument is, well, they're still doing mine-clearing operations there. But again, this is a mistake of not building the right clear and hold force to retake Sunni areas. You don't retake Sunni areas with Kurds. You take it with Sunni Arabs. They were great in Kobani, a Kurdish town. Using the YPG to take back Sunni areas from ISIS will likely result in security backsliding.
But the criticism, Michael, that's been made is that the Arab forces just weren't effective, and the most effective Sunni fighters sided with the more hardline groups.
Well, there was no attempt to build an actual Sunni force. Early on, when General Nagata tried to build that force, there were so many constraints put on him by our National Security Council. You couldn't have anybody join the force that was ever involved with a group that could be linked to a terrorist group. We didn't do that in Iraq during the surge. We actually took former al-Qaeda members, former Sunni insurgent members, and they were part of the awakening, the Sunni awakening, that basically decimated al-Qaeda. No attempt was made to reconcile Sunni Arabs that had joined Jabhat al-Nusra or joined other groups to form this Sunni force, a local Sunni force from Deir ez-Zor and Raqqa to expel ISIS and to hold territory. It's been done with Kurdish forces primarily. And
let me bring in James Andre on this. James, no attempt. You heard Michael say no attempt was made.
Well, maybe no direct attempts, but in the very first place, the Western powers kind of indirectly through Turkey backed the Free Syrian Army, and then eventually the opposition in Syria fragmented, and it became much more difficult. This is why after the Manbij battle, indeed, the United States turned to the YPG forces, who, and this is important to stress, the United States or the European Union do not consider as a terrorist force. It's only Turkey that makes the link between the PKK and the YPG, though there are very obviously links since, just as a detail, but when you're in the armoured vehicles over there, you do see pictures of Abdullah Öcalan, who is the leader of the PKK. You can actually see those, photos inside, etc., etc. There are very clear links, but the US and the Westerners do not consider they're the same organisation.
Jasper Mortimer, in Ankara,
may I jump in here
Jasper,
for a second, please?
Just briefly, let me, very briefly, go ahead.
Yes, I would like to just say that it's very clear that the YPG PKK link is out there, because when I remember the Senate hearing in April 2016, Senator Lindsey Graham was questioning the Secretary of Defense Ashton Carter in the Senate hearing, and the conversation goes by like this. He says that our Turkish allies are very angry. I have been in Ankara because of our support to YPG, and they are saying that this is just the Syrian wing of the PKK terrorist organization. So the Ashton Carter says, we are aware of that. The PKK is the terrorist organization. We and our allies accept PKK as the terrorist organization. And we know that there is substantial links and ties of YPG, PYD to the PKK. And at the end of the conversation, Senator Lindsey Graham says, for the United States, it is the dumbest thing to do that we are doing to our Turkish allies. This whole concept is absurd, he says. In the Senate hearing, you can look at the recordings.
All right, let me bring in Jasper Mortimer on this.
Intelligence documents.
Let me bring in Jasper Mortimer on this.
YPG connection is clearly outlined in all NATO documents.
Jasper Mortimer, what's the mood right now? 4 days in, we've just gotten word of a second Turkish casualty after the launch of this offensive. What's the mood when it comes to the timing and the reasons?
Are you talking about the timing of the attack?
Of the operation by the Turkish government?
Yes, I think the other panelists have elaborated on that well. I think it was very clear that Turkey saw that America was raising its support for the Syrian Kurds. You know, Tillerson said it wasn't a border force, but the coalition announced it as a border force. Whatever you want to call it, the Americans were going to up their assistance to the Syrian Kurds. And I think Turkey gambled that it was better to get in quickly before that greater American assistance had come into play. Turkey doesn't actually want a fight with Americans. There are some 2,000 US personnel on the ground in Syria, and they would have been used in training that border force or whatever it was going to be called. And so Turkey sort of struck in a preemptive mood.
Struck in a preemptive mood. We're going to pick up on that. We have to take a very quick break. Stay with us. You're watching the France 24 debate.
Reporters Plus, presented by Mark Owen.
In northern Iraq, on the Syrian border, Nineveh province is close to the end of the Battle of the Desert. The Shiite elite battalion is on the front line.
مو بس شرط الشيعة أو السنة أو المسيح أو أي إنسان واجب عليه نحمي أي إنسان الله خلقه بهذه الأرض واجب عليه نحمي ونخليه يعيش بأمان وسلام.
Their goal now is to finish the bitter 3-year war against the Islamic State organization and prepare for the aftermath, which will be no less difficult.
Reporters Plus on France 24 and France24.com. Watch France 24 live and on demand via streaming devices such as Roku and Chromecast. Live in 3 languages on Sling in the USA. And on France 24 websites and free dedicated apps for mobiles and tablets. Revisited. Presented by Stuart Norval.
The election of Adama Barrow in 2016 filled Gambians with hope. After 22 years of autocratic rule, Yahya Jammeh was beaten in the elections. His expulsion from the country drew a curtain on a past stained by imprisonment, murder and corruption. But will the new Gambia, promised by the president, live up to expectations?
Revisited on France 24 and France24.com.
People and Profit, presented by Stephen Carroll.
Business news is not about numbers, nor percentages and statistics. Business news is about people and how we live our lives. People and Profit goes beyond numbers to analyse how the global flow of money and profits shape our world. Intelligent and accessible, the show cuts across business, economics and politics.
People and Profit on France 24 and France24.com.
Welcome back. Before we resume the France 24 debate, some of the stories we're following for you in the newsroom. The U.S. Secretary of State warns Russia that it will be held accountable if a suspected new chlorine attack in Syria is confirmed. At the opening of a chemical weapons conference in Paris, France, for its part, announcing asset freezes for 25 companies suspected of helping Damascus gas its citizens. India's Prime Minister warns globalization has lost its luster. Narendra Modi's opening speech at Davos comes as the U.S. announces import duties on solar panels and washing machines. Donald Trump will be addressing the World Economic Forum on Friday. European lawmakers critical of the EU's decision to take Panama off its tax haven blacklist, one of 8 jurisdictions whose status was upgraded just 1 month after the initial publication of the list. And tributes pouring in for Bra Hugh, South African legend Hugh Masekela, the great trumpeter and anti-apartheid campaigner, succumbing to cancer at 78. Welcome back, or welcome if you're just joining us. It's the France 24 debate. Turkey and its president opening up a new front in Syria against the Syrian Kurdish forces. We're talking about it with Ahmed Berat Çonkar, member of parliament for the Turkey's ruling AK party, head of the Turkish delegation to the NATO Parliamentary Assembly. Thank you for being with us again. From Ankara, also in the Turkish capital, correspondent Jasper Mortimer. In the U.S. capital, it is Michael Pregin, adjunct fellow at the Hudson Institute. And France 24's very own James Andre is with us. Yeah, Turkey's president taking on all comers, including the United States.
Afrin will be settled. There won't be a step back from Afrin. We discussed this with our Russian friends. We have an agreement. We also talked to the other coalition powers. We also talked to America, but we could not convince them of one thing. What was that? We told them, why are you combating the Islamic State group with a terror organization? Why are you doing this with a terror organization like the PYG, the YPG or the PKK? Come on, do this with your strategic partner, Turkey.
Michael Pregin, your reaction when you hear Turkey's president?
Well, you know, it's interesting. When ISIS was moving on Kobani in 2014 during the daytime, we saw Turkish tanks overlooking Kobani and not doing anything to help this Kurdish town fall. And it was giving ISIS a huge propaganda win to be able to mobilize during the daytime without being hit. We had to do something. It was an embarrassment to the United States. It was an embarrassment to our ISIS strategy. So we started backing the YPG in Kobani with help from Peshmerga from Iraq. So our special forces advisors worked with the Peshmerga, both the Iraqi and the YPG Kurds, to push back ISIS and hand it its biggest defeat on live television. So I can see why we started working with the YPG, but I agree it's not the right force to use in Sunni areas because it gets rejected. Just like the Shia militias backed by Iran were not the right forces to use to clear ISIS from Sunni towns in Iraq. It just doesn't work. And now we're dealing with the ramifications of that, picking the wrong clear and hold force. And you have Secretary Mattis saying, in one case, ISIS is an ally in the fight against, the YPG is an ally in the fight against ISIS. And on the other hand, saying, but Turkey also views it as a terrorist organization. And saying we're working through this, meaning Afrin, we're not going to do much there, but don't do it in Manbij and don't do it in Raqqa. And I think Erdogan's going to test us, to be honest.
Is that not what it's exactly happening right now? I mean, it does look like the United States is walking a very, very thin line. It's going to have to choose, and indeed, the YPG knew this. I mean, I spoke yesterday to Hedia Youssef, who is the co-president of what they call the Rojava, which is Syrian Kurdistan, and she was telling me that while she's extremely critical of what the United States is doing, she says that she considers that the position that consists of saying that all the United States can do is diplomacy, that they cannot intervene militarily backing the YPG is, she says, shameful, and she says that they refuse this position. So they're starting to feel that they're being dropped by the United States as an ally because, of course, Turkey is a strategic ally. Now, what do you think is going to happen? I mean, indeed, without the backing of the United States, chances are it's going to be very difficult for the Kurds to hold on to any territory at all.
Michael Pregin?
Well, I think it's true. We're seeing Sunni resistance in Raqqa, and the United States, unfortunately, has recent examples of abandoning Kurds. In the case of the KDP Peshmerga in Iraq, the PUK Peshmerga to an extent, and now we're seeing the United States try to compartmentalize its support for the YPG, saying the YPG, they aligned with Russia and Iran in Afrin, so not our problem. But are they going to stand up against Erdogan? Is the United States going to stand up against Erdogan when it comes to Manbij and Raqqa? And again, Erdogan has stated, I'm going to Manbij next, and then I'm going to the Iraqi border. So we have to put some red lines in there, but I would urge, just as a counterinsurgency strategy, start building this Sunni Arab force that's required to hold territory and prevent what General Votel is so concerned about, and that's security backslide. He visited Raqqa, and he's concerned that the right force isn't there to keep ISIS out. And that's something we're likely to see happen. It happened in Mosul in 2014 because the right force didn't hold territory. And we're seeing precursors of that happening again. So we got to get out in front of it. The YPG is not the right force for Raqqa. It's not the right force for Deir ez-Zor.
Jasper Mortimer, the Syrian Kurds control most but not all of that border with Turkey. But there's not a majority Kurdish population everywhere.
No, there's not. Francois, if I can just quickly suggest something to Michael. Michael, I think the word you should be using is not Sunni, but Arab. The Kurds are
Sunni.
Sunni.
Arab, I agree. Yep, Sunni Arab. Yes.
Right. And perhaps one of the reasons why Turkey's intervention began in Afrin rather than in Kamishli Hasakea, the Kurdish stronghold of Syria in the northeast of Syria, is that the Kurdish Arab ratio in Afrin is much more evenly balanced there. The Kurds are in the majority, but only just, narrowly so. And the Kurds have been accused of discriminating against the Arabs in Afrin. For instance, in the summer of 2012, after the Syrian government withdrew its forces from Afrin, because it wanted to use them to fight insurgents elsewhere in the country. The Kurds quickly took control of Afrin and instituted the Kurdish language as the language of instruction in the schools. And the fact that there were many Arab children in the schools didn't matter. They now had to be taught in Kurdish, and that was very unfair. So there's less legitimacy to Kurdish rule in Afrin than there is in Kamishli Hasakea.
Jasper, one other point that we heard President Erdogan talk about in that clip we played a few minutes ago, he talks about Russia and the Kurdish forces in Afrin closer to Moscow, they say, than to Washington. And we have this report that there were some 300 Russian military police in the area that pulled out just ahead of the launch of the offensive.
Yes, and it was believed that, the Kurds, when they took control of Afrin, they also took control of a Syrian government base there, an air base. And it is believed that the Russians and perhaps the Americans, I'm not sure of this, were delivering supplies to the Kurds through that air base. This operation couldn't go ahead without Russian approval. I think Russia is being very ambiguous, or you could even say disingenuous, when it comments on this operation. Because while it says it is calling for restraint, if the Russians wanted to, it could stop it. The Russians control the airspace up there, and if they wanted to, Russian aircraft could destroy the Turkish tanks and armored personnel carriers that are now rolling across the plains of Afrin. It's not doing that. Erdogan said yesterday that Turkey and Russia had reached an agreement on the operation.
Berat Shankar, let me ask you, at this particular point in time, does Turkey have more in common with Russia than with its NATO ally, the United States?
We can just say this. as far as Syria's territorial integrity is concerned, I think that Turkey, Russia, Iran, and Iraq seems to be much more clear and firm in this commitment. When we compare to the United States or other allies' positions, they seem to be trying to build up a YPG force, which may in the future try to get an independent state or kind of a autonomous region. So in this respect, I think that Russia, Turkey, and other regional countries seems to be on the right side as far as defending the territorial integrity of Turkey. Another point regarding Kobani, our friend from United States has mentioned, during that time, as you know, the Turkish army structure was quite different, and we had a coup d'etat with that army. There was a lot of internal resistance and internal difficulties in the Turkish army because of FETÖ, So there are reasons why Turkey did not intervene. But we have let the Peshmerga forces from northern Iraq to enter into Turkish territory and help the people in Kobani, our Kurdish brothers and sisters in Kobani. But as you know, we also opened our borders. Hundreds of thousands of Kurdish people came into Turkey as refugees, and we opened our arms to these people from Kobani and elsewhere. And they are still in Turkey. They have not returned back to the places which is governed by YPG.
And Turkey's president has said. Turkey's president has said today that those refugees, as long as those refugees are still in Turkey, the campaign in Syria will continue.
I mean, we hope that we can free the places where the terrorist organizations are controlling. As you have seen in the Operation Euphrates Shield, now we are building up that area, and we let the local politicians and the local people to build up their environment. We are helping with every humanitarian need there, and there is now 100,000 people got back to that territory of 2,000 square kilometer square that we have cleared from Daesh. So the same thing could be happen in Manbij or in Raqqa or other areas. The people don't want a terrorist organization's offshoot, YPG, to control, because most of the Kurds are not happy with what the YPG is doing in their governance. They are forcing their children to get conscripted into their militia. We are getting a lot of news from Afrin right now. They are taking underage children from their families to get them to the resistance. There is a lot of inhumane, attitudes and things that they are doing. So this group, the YPG, cannot run that places. I mean, there should be Arab, Sunni, and Turkmen, Kurdish, councils that within the opposition, so that there could be a long-term peace and stability in these areas. And that's what we are trying to achieve as Turkey.
On the other side, they view it, of course, differently. Earlier, we spoke to Salih Muslim Muhammad, former chair of the PYD, the Democratic Union Party.
We have no choice only to resist and defend ourselves. We have no other choice. It depends on the international forces and powers, if they are able to stop this, this kind of occupation and invasion to the lands. As you know, Afrin was a very safe haven for all the people. Displaced people from the other areas, they were coming to Afrin area. And now it's hit by Turkish forces and their mercenaries all around, and it's surrounded, is under the siege from 3-4 sides. So this is very brutal attack on the people over there.
Jasper Mortimer, let me ask you, we're getting word that thousands have fled the fighting over the past 4 days. This is a rugged, mountainous area. What lies ahead?
Well, I think the whole operation is very disappointing. Something else could have happened there. We're not hearing that the people are actually fleeing into Turkey. The YPG in Afrin are saying that the people are staying put, but there are some reports that some of the people in Afrin are trying to flee to Aleppo, but they're being stopped. However, look, I'd like to point out your interview with Saleh Muslim is significant because Saleh Muslim came to Ankara at least twice in the years 2012, 2013, 2014. I'm not sure of the dates, but around those times, Saleh Muslim came to Ankara twice. He was hosted by the Turkish foreign minister, then Ahmet Davutoğlu. He gave interviews to the Turkish press. What I'm trying to say is that although the YPG and the PKK are linked, that is undeniable. Turkey is capable of seeing a distinction between those two. At that time when it was entertaining Saleh Muslim, Turkey certainly wasn't entertaining any PKK commanders or envoys in Ankara. But Turkey changed for political reasons. Now, you've also been mentioning Kobani quite a lot tonight. I went into Kobani after it was liberated by the YPG, and I spoke to a YPG commander and a senior PYD official, and it was quite clear to me from what they were saying that the Syrian Kurds want to build an autonomous zone in northern Syria, and to do that they need Turkish construction companies, they need trade with Turkey, they need investment from Turkey. They were asking Turkey to open the gates to them. And so I think this Afrin operation is a disappointment because something diplomatically could have happened. You know, if Ankara had said to the Syrian Kurds, listen, we will give you trade, we'll let our construction companies come across and build your infrastructure, but you must not give any weapons to the PKK. You must not allow the PKK to have any bases in Syrian Kurdistan. And you must allow Turkish military monitors to live in your area to make sure that those rules are not broken. I am sure that the Syrian Kurds would have accepted such a deal because Turkey is such an economic powerhouse. It has everything the Syrian Kurds need to build their autonomous zone. But Turkey didn't make such an offer like that because President Recep Tayyip Erdogan does not want a Syrian Kurdish autonomous zone. He has said that, and he doesn't want it because he knows that it will embolden Turkish Kurds. Turkish Kurds will then say to Ankara, we want what our Syrian cousins have. So, you know, Erdogan says that this operation in Afrin is being conducted for military reasons. But I think the real reason is political. Turkey does not want a Syrian autonomous zone a la the Iraqi Kurdish autonomous zone to emerge.
Michael Pregent, will the end result of all this be that both sides, Turkey and the United States, are going to get bogged down in Syria?
Well, I think what it means is the YPG will continue to look for leverage with Russia and Iran and with the United States. But they have a recent example of abandonment by Russia and Iran in Afrin, and they're likely to see the same thing with the United States unless we hold firm. So I think you'll see the United States accede, acquiesce to Erdogan, and that's not a good message. As we try to build these alliances, we can't have so many recent examples of betrayal and abandonment. It just doesn't bode well for interactions on the ground with U.S. forces and whoever we decide to be our new temporary ally in the fight against ISIS.
James Andre, let me ask you, you were in Raqqa for its liberation. That was in November.
Yeah.
But that's only 2 months ago, right?
Yeah, that's correct.
We're talking as if the war has been won against ISIS. Is that the case?
Well, the thing is, indeed, ISIS has practically no territorial control left in Syria. And this is why what's happening now is happening. Basically, the common enemy between groups that are foes usually has disappeared. So, indeed, what we're seeing is former enemies who allied against ISIS go back to where they were before, indeed, enemies. But what is very worrying is that, indeed, maybe ISIS has disappeared or is, you know, it's coming to an end as far as territorial grip is concerned. What is very frightening is that I've been to Raqqa, and Raqqa is now a complete ruin. There's nothing left of the city. Like, for example, when indeed the Turkish say that people should go back, there's nothing to go back to. It's a heap of rubble right now. But what is more worrying is that all the political aspirations of Sunni Arabs in Syria and the ground reasons why ISIS emerged in the first place have not been addressed. Right now, they're exactly in the same situation they were before the war in Syria started. And it's the same situation across the border in Iraq. They're in the same situation than in 2011. The only difference is now their cities are destroyed, their relatives have been killed in this war, and they've had absolutely nothing. Now, there is one big question mark, is what kind of balance of power or deal or negotiation you're going to be able to offer to these Sunni Arabs in Syria in order to build some sort of peace.
Berat Shankar, is it possible to get the Kurds and the Sunni Arabs all around the table on both sides of the border?
First of all, I would say that Turkey is not taking on Syria's Kurds. Turkey is fighting against a terrorist group within the Kurds in Syria, and which is part of the KCK or PKK Syrian wing. We don't have any problem with our Kurdish brothers and sisters. For hundreds of years, we are living together with Turks and Kurds inside Turkey, outside Turkey. We don't have any problems with anybody. And as far as the Salih-Muslim issue is concerned, as you know, at that time, Turkey was trying to convince PKK to lay down its arms and settle for a peace process inside Turkey. And we were taking big risks. Mr. Erdogan was taking this risk, and he was trying to achieve this. And the talks with Salih-Muslim was also a part of this process. But unfortunately, PKK, emboldened by the support from the United States and some promises maybe from other countries that they might have an independent state or autonomous region, they decided to kill or finish this peace process and attack Turkish policemen and civilians and military personnel, and they started to fight again.
So that peace process
that was not our choice to.
That peace process is dead in the water for now.
To finish this process.
Berat Shankar, unfortunately, we're running short on time.
What I'm saying is that
you have the final word there.
I'm just trying to say that we would like to have the Syria's Kurds, Arabs, Turkmens all together to achieve the peace and stability, and we are going to do all the best we can, and we are already doing that inside of Turkey. Humanitarian wise, we are feeding 4 million Syrian refugees right now. 350,000 Kurds are inside Turkey. So they are with us. We don't think that YPG or PKK is representing the Kurds, and we hope that we will achieve this peace soon.
Berat Shankar, I want to thank you so much for joining us from
Ankara.
I want to thank Jasper Mortimer and Michael Pregin, as well as James Andre. Media Watch is next.